Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into one of the most fascinating and utterly bizarre periods in human history, the Victorian era. We're talking about a time when society had more rules than a monastery, more restrictions than a prison, and more ways to accidentally ruin your reputation than you could shake a perfectly gloved hand at. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, adjust your pillow, and let the world slow down around you. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going back to a time when showing your ankle was scandalous, when the wrong fork could end a friendship, and when a single misstep in conversation could brand you as socially dead faster than you could say, "Good heavens." Picture this, it's 1857, and you've just woken up in London. But this isn't the London you know. This is a city where every gesture, every word, every piece of clothing you wear is governed by an invisible but ironclad set of rules that would make modern etiquette look like complete anarchy. Welcome to Victorian society, where survival wasn't just about avoiding disease or poverty, it was about navigating a social minefield so complex that one wrong step could destroy your entire future. This is the story of how ordinary people lived, breathed, and somehow survived in a world where propriety was everything, where reputation was more valuable than gold, and where the difference between respectability and ruin could be as simple as the way you held your teacup. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901, wasn't just a period of time, it was a complete system of social control disguised as civilization. Named after Queen Victoria, who ruled for 63 years and 7 months, this era created the most elaborate, restrictive, and downright bizarre set of social rules the world had ever seen. But here's what's truly mind-boggling, people didn't just follow these rules. They embraced them, defended them, and built their entire identities around them. Why? Because in Victorian society, your social standing wasn't just about comfort or convenience, it was literally a matter of survival. The Victorian class system was like a massive pyramid, with the queen at the very top, followed by the aristocracy, then the upper middle class, the lower middle class, the working class, and finally the poor, who barely counted as people at all in the eyes of respectable society. But here's the catch, unlike previous eras where your birth determined everything, the Victorian period offered something revolutionary and terrifying, social mobility. For the first time in history, you could actually climb the social ladder. A merchant could become a gentleman. A clerk could join the middle class. A factory owner could buy his way into respectability. But, and this is a massive but, you could also fall. One scandal, one breach of etiquette, one moment of impropriety, and you could tumble down that ladder faster than a Victorian lady fainting at the sight of a bare ankle. This possibility of both rising and falling created an atmosphere of constant anxiety. Everyone was watching everyone else, looking for signs of weakness, impropriety, or God forbid, vulgarity. The rules weren't just suggestions, they were the difference between acceptance and exile, between prosperity and poverty, between being somebody and being nobody. The concept of respectability became the holy grail of Victorian life. But what exactly was respectability? It wasn't just about having money, plenty of wealthy people were considered vulgar. It wasn't just about birth, many aristocrats were seen as dissolute and immoral. Respectability was about demonstrating through every aspect of your behavior that you possessed the moral character, self-control, and refinement that Victorian society valued above all else. This meant that every single thing you did was a performance. The way you dressed, the way you spoke, the way you walked, the way you ate, the way you entertained, even the way you grieved, all of it had to conform to an incredibly specific set of expectations. The pressure was enormous. Victorian diaries and letters are filled with anxiety about social missteps, fear of being found out as not quite respectable enough, and desperate attempts to decode the ever-changing rules of proper behavior. Perhaps most insidious was how Victorian respectability turned everyone into both performer and audience. You weren't just trying to follow the rules, you were also constantly judging others for their adherence to those same rules. This created a society of mutual surveillance where everyone was both watched and watching, judged and judging. The consequences of failure were severe. Social ostracism could mean economic ruin, as business relationships, employment opportunities, and even basic services could be denied to those who had fallen from grace. For women, the stakes were even higher. A damaged reputation could mean spinsterhood, poverty, and complete social isolation. Your day as a respectable Victorian began before you even opened your eyes, because how you woke up, what you wore, and how you prepared yourself for the world were all subject to the iron laws of propriety. Let's start with the ladies, because their morning ritual was nothing short of an architectural project. A Victorian woman didn't just get dressed, she was constructed, layer by layer, into the approved feminine form. The process began with the chemise, a long linen undergarment that covered her from neck to ankles. This ensured that no part of her actual body would ever come into direct contact with her outer clothing. Next came the corset. And oh, the corset. Made from whalebone, steel, or cane, and laced so tightly that breathing became a conscious effort, the corset was designed to create the ideal Victorian silhouette, a waist so small it looked like it might snap in a strong breeze. Women regularly fainted from lack of oxygen, developed permanent rib deformities, and suffered from what doctors delicately called corset liver, actual organ displacement caused by constant pressure. But here's the truly insane part: women defended the corset. They argued that it provided support, that it was necessary for proper posture, that it was essential for respectability. Why? Because a woman without a corset was considered undressed, improper, and dangerously close to being a fallen woman. After the corset came the bustle, a framework of wire, whalebone, or horsehair that extended the skirt dramatically behind the wearer. Women had to learn to navigate doorways sideways, to sit on the very edge of chairs, and to walk in a way that prevented their enormous skirts from knocking over furniture, small children, or other women. Then came the dress itself, followed by mandatory accessories. Gloves were essential. A lady never appeared in public with bare hands. The gloves had to be the right length for the occasion, the right color for the outfit, and the right material for the season. Hats were equally complex. A Victorian lady never left the house without a hat, and it had to be appropriate for the time of day, the season, the occasion, and her social status. Hair was perhaps the most complex aspect of the morning ritual. Victorian hairstyles were elaborate constructions that could take hours to create and required the assistance of a maid or family member. Hair was never worn loose in public, that was the mark of a child or a woman of questionable virtue. For men, the morning ritual was somewhat simpler but no less important. The Victorian gentleman was expected to be impeccably groomed at all times, a fresh shave every day, carefully styled hair, and spotless, pressed clothing appropriate for the day's activities. By the time a respectable Victorian had completed their morning routine, they had already navigated dozens of potential social pitfalls. And the day had barely begun. If you thought getting dressed was complicated, wait until you hear about the Victorian system of social visiting, known as calling. This wasn't just dropping by to say hello, this was a complex social ritual that could make or break relationships and literally decide whether you would be accepted or ostracized by your community. The calling system was based on calling cards, small, elegantly printed cards bearing your name and address. These little pieces of cardboard were basically the social media of the Victorian era. When you wanted to establish a social relationship with someone, you left your calling card with their servant, indicating your desire to be received. If the person was at home to visitors, which didn't necessarily mean they were physically present, they would return your call within a specific time period, usually within a week. There were different types of calls, each with its own rules. A first call was different from a return call, which was different from a condolence call. The length of each call was strictly prescribed, 15 minutes for a first call, 20 minutes for a return call. Staying too long was rude and pushy. Leaving too early was insulting. Morning calls, which confusingly took place in the afternoon, were the most formal and were typically made between 2 and 5 p.m. There were certain days when specific types of people received visitors, Mondays for business associates, Tuesdays for social acquaintances, and so forth. The conversation during a call was as carefully choreographed as a ballet. The weather was always safe, as were general inquiries about health and family. Literature and art were acceptable, provided you didn't express opinions that were too strong. Politics, business, and anything remotely personal were strictly off-limits. The calling card itself could convey messages through subtle variations. A card with the corner turned down indicated that the caller had come in person rather than sending a servant. Different corners turned down had different meanings, one for congratulations, another for condolences. For women, the calling system was particularly important because it was one of the few ways they could establish and maintain social relationships outside their immediate family. A woman's calling list was a reflection of her social position, and being dropped from someone's calling list could be socially devastating. If you thought calling was complicated, Victorian dining was like navigating a minefield while blindfolded. The dining room wasn't just a place to eat, it was the ultimate testing ground for social acceptability, where a single wrong move with a fork could brand you as hopelessly vulgar. The Victorian dinner party was the pinnacle of social performance, a carefully orchestrated event that could last for hours. Everything from the seating arrangement to the final toast was governed by strict protocols. The seating arrangement was a complex puzzle that reflected and reinforced social hierarchies. The host sat at one end of the table, the hostess at the other. The most important male guest sat to the right of the hostess, the most important female guest to the right of the host. Everyone else was arranged according to their social rank. The table setting itself required a degree in engineering to navigate. A proper Victorian place setting could include up to 12 different pieces of silverware, each designed for a specific course. There were soup spoons and dessert spoons, fish forks and meat forks, butter knives and fruit knives. Using the wrong utensil was a grave breach of etiquette. The meal was served in multiple courses, typically 7 to 12 courses for a formal dinner party. Each course had its own rules, its own utensils, and its own conversational expectations. Perhaps the most challenging aspect was the conversation. You were expected to talk to the person on your right during the first course, then turn to the person on your left for the second course, alternating throughout the meal. This was called turning the table, and it was orchestrated by the hostess. Topics of conversation were strictly regulated. Politics, religion, business, and anything remotely personal were absolutely forbidden. Instead, you made light, entertaining conversation about safe topics, the weather, literature, nothing too controversial, art, nothing too modern, and travel, nothing too exotic. Women faced additional challenges. They were expected to eat very little, taking tiny bites and leaving food on their plates to demonstrate their delicate appetites. A woman who ate heartily was considered vulgar and unfeminine. The end of the meal was as ritualized as the beginning. The ladies would retire to the drawing room for coffee and light conversation, while the gentlemen remained at the table for port, cigars, and more serious discussion. This separation of the sexes was considered essential for proper social order. Victorian society was obsessed with hidden meanings and secret codes. Two of the most elaborate were the language of flowers and the language of fans, complex systems of symbolic communication that every respectable Victorian was expected to master. In a society where direct expression of emotion was considered vulgar, flowers provided a way to communicate feelings that couldn't be spoken. But this wasn't just "roses mean love." The Victorian flower language was incredibly specific and nuanced. A red rose meant passionate love. A white rose meant pure love. A yellow rose meant friendship. A pink rose meant gratitude or admiration. The number of roses mattered too. A single rose meant, "You are my one and only," while a dozen meant, "Be mine." But roses were just the beginning. Every flower had its own meaning. Forget-me-nots meant true love and remembrance. Daisies meant innocence and purity. Violets meant modesty and faithfulness. The way flowers were presented carried meaning too. Flowers given upside down meant the opposite of their usual meaning. Flowers presented with the right hand meant yes, while flowers presented with the left hand meant no. The language of fans was equally elaborate and perhaps even more practical, since a lady always carried a fan. A fan held in the right hand in front of the face meant, "Follow me." A fan held in the left hand meant, "I wish to speak to you." A fan drawn across the cheek meant, "I love you." A fan drawn across the forehead meant, "We are watched." These coded languages weren't just romantic games, they were essential tools for communication in a society that severely restricted direct expression. Young people used them to conduct courtships under the watchful eyes of chaperones. Victorian courtship was like playing chess while blindfolded underwater with your hands tied behind your back. The process of finding a spouse was so hedged with rules and restrictions that it's amazing anyone ever managed to get married at all. The courtship process began long before any actual courting took place. Parents, particularly mothers, spent years preparing their daughters for the marriage market, teaching them accomplishments that would make them attractive to potential suitors: playing piano, singing, speaking French, painting watercolors, engaging in light conversation. The coming out process was the formal introduction of a young lady to society and the marriage market. This typically happened when she turned 18 and involved a series of elaborate social events, culminating in the debutante ball. But even after coming out, a young lady couldn't simply meet and talk to young men. All interactions had to be carefully supervised. A young man had to first gain an introduction through mutual friends or family members. Once introduced, he could request permission to call on the young lady at her family's home, but these calls were strictly supervised. A young couple was never allowed to be alone together, not even for a few minutes. The chaperone's job was to ensure that nothing improper occurred and that the young lady's reputation remained spotless. Physical contact was virtually forbidden. A young man might offer his arm to escort a young woman, but even this had to be performed correctly. Holding hands was considered extremely intimate and generally reserved for engaged couples. Kissing before engagement was absolutely scandalous and could ruin a young woman's reputation permanently. The proposal itself was a formal affair. The young man had to ask the father's permission before proposing to the daughter. If the father agreed, the young man could make his proposal, properly, on bended knee, with a formal speech and a ring. Even after engagement, interactions remained strictly regulated. The couple could spend time together, but always with chaperonage. The engagement period was used to plan the wedding and allow families to evaluate the match. The entire system was designed to ensure that marriages were based on social compatibility and family approval rather than romantic love. While love might develop within marriage, it wasn't considered necessary for a successful union. Death in Victorian society wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a social event that required elaborate rituals, specific clothing, and carefully orchestrated displays of grief that could last for years. The Victorian mourning process began the moment someone died and could continue for years afterward, with different phases requiring different behaviors, clothing, and social restrictions. The length depended on your relationship to the deceased. A widow might mourn for 2.5 years, while a distant cousin might observe only 6 months. Let's start with the widow, because her mourning requirements were the most elaborate. When a Victorian woman's husband died, she essentially disappeared from normal society and entered a shadowy world governed entirely by the rules of grief. For the first year and a day, she was in deep mourning, which meant she could wear nothing but black, and not just any black, but specific types of black fabric with specific types of trim. The deep mourning dress was made from materials like bombazine, crepe, or merino wool, all in the deepest, most light-absorbing black possible. The widow's jewelry was restricted to jet, black enamel, or mourning jewelry made from the hair of the deceased. Yes, they actually made jewelry from dead people's hair, and it was considered the height of sentimental fashion. The widow's social life during deep mourning was severely restricted. She couldn't attend parties, theaters, or any form of entertainment. She couldn't receive visitors except for close family members. Her world shrank to her home, her church, and the cemetery. After the first year and a day, the widow entered second mourning, which lasted for 9 months. During this period, she could begin to add small amounts of white, gray, or purple to her wardrobe, but black remained dominant. The final phase was half-mourning, which lasted for 6 months. During this period, the widow could wear gray, purple, and white, though black was still preferred. She could begin to participate in quiet social activities, though anything too festive was still forbidden. Only after completing the full 2.5 years could a widow return to normal dress and social activities. Mourning requirements extended beyond clothing. Mourning stationery had to be used for all correspondence, paper with black borders that got progressively narrower as the mourning period progressed. Even the wax used to seal letters had to be black. The home itself had to be transformed. Mirrors were covered with black cloth or turned to face the wall. Clocks were stopped at the time of death. Windows were draped with black crepe. The entire house became a shrine to grief. The funeral itself was an elaborate public display that reflected the family's social status. Victorian funerals could involve elaborate processions with professional mourners, ornate hearses pulled by black horses with black plumes, and ceremonies that lasted for hours. Post-mortem photography became popular, with families commissioning formal portraits of the deceased, often posed as if they were merely sleeping. These photographs were treasured family heirlooms displayed prominently in the home. Victorian children weren't just small adults, they were an entirely separate category of human being with their own elaborate set of rules, restrictions, and expectations. Childhood in the Victorian era was simultaneously idealized and strictly controlled. The Victorian concept of childhood was heavily influenced by religious beliefs about original sin and moral development. Children were seen as naturally sinful creatures who needed to be carefully trained and disciplined to become proper Christian adults. Victorian children's clothing was a miniature version of adult fashion, complete with all the discomfort and restriction. Little girls wore corsets from a very young age, along with multiple layers of petticoats and long dresses. Little boys wore dresses until they were about 4 or 5 years old, at which point they were breeched, given their first pair of trousers in a ceremony marking their transition from babyhood to boyhood. The clothing wasn't just about appearance, it was about training children in proper behavior. The restrictive nature made it impossible for them to move freely or engage in rough play, which was exactly the point. Children were expected to sit still, walk sedately, and behave with the same decorum expected of adults. Education was highly gendered. Boys were prepared for careers in business, law, medicine, or the military, studying Latin, Greek, mathematics, and science. Girls were trained for their future roles as wives and mothers, focusing on accomplishments like music, drawing, French, and domestic skills. The nursery was carefully designed to promote proper moral development. Decorations featured religious themes or moral lessons. Children's books were filled with stories about good children who were rewarded and bad children who suffered terrible consequences. Toys were chosen for their educational and moral value rather than entertainment. Play was highly supervised and regulated. Children weren't allowed to play freely or make noise that might disturb adults. Their games had to be quiet, orderly, and educational. Rough play, loud voices, and spontaneous behavior were all discouraged. The relationship between Victorian children and their parents was formal and distant by modern standards. Children addressed their parents as mother and father, or mama and papa, never by first names. They were required to stand when adults entered the room and to speak only when spoken to. Discipline was strict and often harsh. Victorian parents believed that sparing the rod would spoil the child, and physical punishment was considered not only acceptable but necessary for proper moral development. Religious education was crucial. Children attended church services, participated in family prayers, and memorized Bible verses. They were taught that God was always watching them and that their behavior on earth would determine their fate in the afterlife. Running a Victorian household was like managing a small corporation, complete with complex hierarchies, detailed job descriptions, and elaborate systems of management. The Victorian middle and upper classes were utterly dependent on domestic servants to maintain their way of life. The Victorian servant hierarchy was as complex and rigid as the social hierarchy of the larger society. At the top was the butler, the male head of the household staff. Below him was the housekeeper, who managed the female servants. Then came, in descending order, the cook, the lady's maid, the valet, the parlour maid, the housemaid, the kitchen maid, and at the bottom, the scullery maid. Each position had specific duties, specific uniforms, and specific rules about interaction with family members and other servants. The butler was responsible for managing the wine cellar, serving at formal dinners, and answering the door to important visitors. He wore formal black clothing and maintained a dignified, professional demeanor. The lady's maid was perhaps the most privileged of the female servants, with direct access to the mistress of the house. She helped with dressing and undressing, arranged hair, maintained clothing and jewelry, and often served as a confidant. At the other end was the scullery maid, typically a young girl who did the dirtiest and most menial work, washing dishes, scrubbing pots, cleaning floors. She worked long hours for very little pay and had virtually no contact with the family she served. The relationship between employers and servants was governed by elaborate rules. Servants were expected to be invisible when not directly needed, to speak only when spoken to, and to maintain perfect discretion about family affairs. The physical separation was carefully maintained. Servants used separate staircases, ate in separate dining areas, and lived in separate quarters, usually in the basement or attic. They were not supposed to be seen by guests unless performing their duties. The servant's day began before dawn and ended long after the family had gone to bed. A typical housemaid might rise at 5 a.m. to light fires, clean grates, and prepare the house. Her day might not end until 10 or 11 p.m. Wages were generally quite low, but the position provided room, board, and security. For many working-class people, domestic service was one of the few ways to escape poverty and gain respectability. However, the work was demanding, the hours were long, and the social restrictions were severe. The servant problem was a constant topic of conversation among Victorian middle-class women. Finding good servants was difficult, keeping them was challenging, and managing them required constant attention. The number and quality of servants a family employed was a direct reflection of their social status and financial resources. The ability to manage servants effectively was seen as a mark of good breeding and social competence. If there was one ritual that defined Victorian social life more than any other, it was the taking of tea. But Victorian tea service wasn't just about drinking a hot beverage, it was an elaborate social ceremony that could last for hours and involved more rules than a diplomatic summit. The tradition of afternoon tea was supposedly invented by Anna, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, in the 1840s. She found herself feeling faint in the late afternoon due to the long gap between lunch and dinner, so she began having tea and light refreshments brought to her room. She soon began inviting friends to join her, and the practice spread throughout fashionable society. But afternoon tea evolved into something far more complex than a simple snack. Proper Victorian tea service required specific equipment: the teapot, hot water pot, cream jug, sugar bowl, slop bowl, tea strainers, tea caddies, and an array of cups, saucers, and plates in matching patterns. The finest tea services were made from bone china or silver and could cost more than a working man's annual wages. The preparation of tea was a ritual in itself. The water had to be brought to a full boil, then poured over the tea leaves. The tea had to steep for exactly the right amount of time, too little and it would be weak, too much and it would be bitter. The hostess would typically prepare the tea herself, as this was considered too important to delegate. The food served with tea was carefully selected and arranged: savory items like cucumber sandwiches or meat pasties, sweet items like cakes and pastries, and finally fresh fruit or nuts. Each type of food had its own serving utensils and its own rules for consumption. The conversation during tea was as carefully orchestrated as the service itself. The weather was always safe, as were general inquiries about health and family. Literature and art were acceptable, provided the discussion remained light. Politics, business, and religion were strictly off-limits. The physical act of drinking tea was governed by specific rules. The teacup had to be held properly, with the thumb and forefinger gripping the handle and the middle finger supporting it from below. The little finger was never extended, despite popular belief. When stirring tea, the spoon was moved back and forth in a straight line, never in circles, and never allowed to clink against the cup. The timing was crucial. Afternoon tea typically began at 4 p.m. and could last until 6 p.m., but guests were expected to arrive and depart at appropriate intervals. Arriving too early suggested eagerness, arriving too late was rude. Staying too long was equally problematic. The guest list was carefully constructed to ensure compatible personalities and appropriate social mixing. Being invited to someone's regular tea circle was a sign of social acceptance. Being excluded was a clear signal of social disapproval. For many Victorian women, afternoon tea was one of the few opportunities for regular social interaction outside their immediate families. It provided a forum for sharing news, discussing social events, and maintaining the complex network of relationships that defined Victorian society. Stepping outside your home in Victorian society was like entering a minefield where every gesture, every glance, and every word could potentially explode your reputation. Public behavior was governed by an incredibly complex set of rules that varied depending on your gender, social class, time of day, season, and even the weather. For Victorian ladies, simply walking down the street was a performance. A lady never walked quickly, that suggested lower-class origins or unseemly urgency. She never walked slowly enough to appear to be loitering, that might suggest she was looking for improper attention. The proper pace was a measured, dignified glide that demonstrated both purpose and refinement. The way a lady held herself while walking was equally important. Her back had to be straight, her head held high but not proudly, her arms at her sides but not stiffly. She couldn't swing her arms or take long strides, both were considered masculine. Her skirts had to be managed carefully to prevent them from dragging in the dirt or revealing too much of her feet and ankles. Eye contact on the street was a delicate matter. A lady couldn't stare at people, that was rude and forward. But she also couldn't appear to be deliberately avoiding eye contact, that might suggest she had something to hide. The proper technique was to look straight ahead with occasional brief glances, acknowledging acquaintances with a slight nod but never stopping to chat unless circumstances were appropriate. Speaking to strangers on the street was absolutely forbidden for respectable ladies. If a strange man attempted to speak to her, a lady was supposed to ignore him completely and continue on her way. Even acknowledging such an approach could be interpreted as encouragement and could damage her reputation. For gentlemen, the rules were somewhat different but equally complex. A gentleman was expected to tip his hat to any lady of his acquaintance, but the type of hat tip varied depending on his relationship to the lady. A slight touch of the hat brim was appropriate for casual acquaintances, while full removal was required for close friends or social superiors. Shopping presented its own challenges. Ladies were expected to shop only at certain times of day and only at establishments that catered to respectable clientele. Bargaining was considered vulgar and was left to servants or lower-class customers. A respectable lady paid the asking price without question. Public transportation presented numerous opportunities for social missteps. Ladies traveling alone were viewed with suspicion, as respectable women were expected to be accompanied by family members, friends, or servants. The type of transportation used also sent social messages. Private carriages indicated wealth and status, while omnibuses and trains were associated with the middle and working classes. The behavior expected on public transportation was strictly regulated. Passengers were expected to be quiet, orderly, and respectful of others' space. Loud conversation, eating, or any behavior that drew attention was inappropriate. Even waiting for transport required proper behavior. Ladies were expected to wait patiently and quietly, never appearing anxious or impatient. They couldn't pace, fidget, or show any signs of distress. The consequences of improper public behavior could be severe and long-lasting. Gossip traveled quickly through Victorian society, and a single incident could damage a person's reputation for years. Women were particularly vulnerable, as their reputations were more fragile and the standards for their behavior more restrictive. In Victorian society, looking respectable wasn't just about vanity, it was an economic necessity that could determine your ability to find employment, make advantageous marriages, maintain business relationships, and participate in the social networks that controlled access to opportunities. The cost of maintaining a proper Victorian appearance was enormous, and families often went into debt or made significant sacrifices to ensure they looked the part. The Victorian wardrobe was extensive and specialized to an absurd degree. A respectable lady needed different outfits for morning, afternoon, and evening, different clothes for different seasons, different ensembles for different types of social events. The complexity was staggering: morning dresses, walking dresses, carriage dresses, visiting dresses, dinner dresses, ball gowns, opera cloaks, riding habits, traveling costumes, and morning clothes. A single evening gown could cost more than a working man's annual wages. The finest fabrics, silk, velvet, lace, were imported at enormous expense. The construction required skilled seamstresses who charged premium prices. And the accessories, gloves, shoes, jewelry, fans, parasols, could easily double the cost. But here's the truly insidious part: Victorian fashion changed constantly, making last year's expensive wardrobe suddenly unfashionable. Sleeves might go from narrow to wide, skirts from full to slim, colors from bright to subdued, all within a single season. A lady who appeared in an outdated style would be immediately marked as poor, provincial, or socially unaware. The pressure to keep up with fashion created a whole industry of fashion magazines, pattern books, and style guides that told people what they should be wearing. These publications were eagerly consumed by anyone who hoped to maintain their social position. For men, the situation was somewhat different but equally expensive. The Victorian gentleman's wardrobe was more stable, but it required equally high-quality materials and construction. The quality was judged by subtle details invisible to the untrained eye but immediately apparent to those who understood fashion. The economic burden extended far beyond clothing. Personal grooming required significant investment. Ladies needed cosmetics, applied so subtly they appeared natural, hair accessories, perfumes, and the services of hairdressers and ladies' maids. Gentlemen required regular visits to barbers, high-quality shaving equipment, pomades and hair tonics, and often the services of a valet. The home itself was an extension of personal appearance. The furnishings, decorations, and general appearance were subject to the same scrutiny as personal clothing. Victorian homes required frequent redecorating to keep up with changing fashions. The servants themselves were part of the household's appearance and had to be properly dressed and trained. The carriage and horses were another significant expense essential for maintaining proper appearance. Even social activities required significant financial investment. Entertaining guests required expensive food, wine, and decorations. Attending social events required appropriate clothing and often gifts for the hosts. The pressure to maintain appearances created a whole economy of credit, debt, and financial manipulation. Families would borrow money to purchase clothing and furnishings, hoping that their investment in appearance would pay off through better business opportunities, advantageous marriages, or social connections. The used clothing market became an important part of the Victorian economy as families sold outdated or unwanted garments to raise money for new purchases. The psychological toll of this constant economic pressure was enormous. Victorian diaries and letters are filled with anxiety about money, worry about keeping up appearances, and fear of social disgrace if financial problems became apparent. By the 1890s, cracks were beginning to show in the elaborate edifice of Victorian social rules. The very complexity that had made the system so effective at maintaining social order was also making it increasingly difficult to sustain. The bicycle, of all things, became one of the most subversive forces in Victorian society. When the safety bicycle was introduced in the 1880s, it gave people, especially women, a new freedom of movement that was difficult to regulate. A woman on a bicycle couldn't maintain the slow, dignified pace expected of a proper lady. She couldn't wear the elaborate, restrictive clothing that Victorian fashion demanded, and she couldn't be constantly chaperoned. The bicycle required new types of clothing, shorter skirts, more practical fabrics, less restrictive undergarments. It encouraged physical activity and independence in ways that challenged traditional ideas about feminine delicacy. The telephone was another technology that disrupted traditional social protocols. Victorian calling rituals had been based on physical presence and formal introductions. The telephone allowed people to communicate directly without elaborate intermediary steps. Young people could talk without chaperones. Business could be conducted without formal visits. The growth of department stores and mass-produced goods began to democratize fashion and consumption. When ready-made clothing became widely available, it became more difficult to distinguish between the genuinely wealthy and those who were simply good at creating the appearance of prosperity. The expansion of education, particularly for women, created new challenges. As more women became educated and intellectually engaged, the restrictions on their conversation and activities became increasingly difficult to maintain. The New Woman movement of the 1890s explicitly challenged many Victorian assumptions. These women advocated for greater independence, professional opportunities, and personal freedom. They rejected the idea that women should be passive, dependent, and primarily concerned with domestic matters. World War I delivered the final blow to many Victorian social conventions. The war required women to take on new roles incompatible with traditional ideas about feminine delicacy. Women worked in factories, drove ambulances, and took on professional responsibilities previously reserved for men. The enormous casualties disrupted the social networks and family structures that had supported Victorian society. The families that had maintained elaborate social rituals were devastated by loss and no longer had the emotional energy or financial resources to continue the old ways. The post-war period saw a deliberate rejection of many Victorian values. The younger generation, traumatized by war and disillusioned with the society that had produced such carnage, embraced new forms of music, fashion, and behavior that explicitly challenged Victorian propriety. The legacy. However, the legacy of Victorian social rules didn't disappear entirely. Many basic principles of politeness, consideration for others, and social responsibility that had been embedded in Victorian etiquette continued to influence behavior long after the specific rules had been abandoned. The idea that how you present yourself to the world matters, that social relationships require careful attention and maintenance, and that there are appropriate and inappropriate ways to behave in different situations, these concepts survived even as their particular expressions changed. Modern etiquette books still reflect many Victorian principles, though adapted to contemporary conditions. The emphasis on consideration for others, the importance of making people feel comfortable in social situations, and the idea that good manners are a form of respect, these are all Victorian concepts that continue to influence how we think about proper behavior. The Victorian obsession with appearance and social performance also left a lasting mark. The idea that success requires not just competence but also the ability to present oneself appropriately, that social skills are as important as technical skills, and that first impressions matter enormously, these are Victorian concepts that remain relevant today. Perhaps most importantly, the Victorian era demonstrated both the power and the limitations of social rules as a means of organizing society. The elaborate behavioral code succeeded in creating a stable, orderly society capable of remarkable achievements in science, technology, literature, and the arts. But they also created enormous pressure on individuals to conform to expectations that might not match their personal desires, and they ultimately proved too rigid and complex to survive the social and economic changes of the 20th century. And so we come to the end of our journey through the labyrinthine world of Victorian social rules. What we've discovered is a society that was simultaneously admirable and absurd, sophisticated and suffocating, elegant and exhausting. The Victorians created a social system of unprecedented complexity and refinement. But they also created a world where a misplaced fork could ruin your reputation and a poorly timed visit could destroy a friendship. The Victorian era reminds us that social rules are not natural laws but human creations designed to serve particular purposes in particular times and places. The elaborate etiquette served important functions, it provided structure and predictability in a rapidly changing world, created opportunities for social mobility while maintaining social order, and established standards of behavior that promoted courtesy, consideration, and mutual respect. But the Victorian experience also shows us the dangers of allowing social rules to become too rigid, too complex, and too divorced from genuine human needs. When the form becomes more important than the substance, when the performance matters more than the person, when the rules serve the system rather than the people within it, then social conventions become social prisons. The legacy of the Victorian era is complex and contradictory. We can admire the elegance, refinement, and attention to detail that characterized Victorian society while also recognizing the oppression, anxiety, and artificiality that these same qualities could create. Perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from the Victorian era is that social rules should serve human flourishing rather than constraining it. The best social conventions are those that help people treat each other with respect and kindness, that create opportunities for meaningful connection and cooperation, and that adapt to changing circumstances and evolving human needs. The Victorians may have taken social rules to an extreme that we find difficult to imagine today, but their underlying insight, that how we treat each other matters, that social relationships require care and attention, and that civilization depends on our willingness to consider the needs and feelings of others, remains as relevant today as it was in the drawing rooms and tea parlors of the 19th century.